This is the briefing from BBC News. The latest headlines. Stock markets are again recording huge losses in response to the coronavirus pandemic. At one point, the Nikkei index in Japan was down by 10%. It has since recovered slightly. All major sport is now being suspended across the United States, and Broadway performances are off for a month. Now it's time to look at the stories that are making the headlines in the media right across the world. And we begin with the Daily Telegraph and Boris Johnson's warning that many more families will lose loved ones. The paper describes the next steps as detailed by the Prime Minister as a nuanced response. However, The Guardian says medical, scientific and public health experts have criticised the UK's approach. The papers say the measures put England at odds with neighbouring countries. The Financial Times leads with the trauma on global markets, the worst day for the FTSE 100 since Black Monday in 1987. The Japan Times carries a warning that specialist ECMO machines that are needed to help severe cases of coronavirus are in very short supply, and most are already being used with patients for other serious heart and lung issues. And Bloomberg are reporting that Italy's school shutdown is driving a surge in internet traffic as students turn to online video games to stave off boredom. And seeing as social distancing is becoming the new norm, Harvard Business Review carries a very useful report on how to avoid handshaking. Well, with me now is Mark Davis, CEO of the strategy consultancy Camberton. We didn't shake hands when you came in today for good reason. It's very hard not to, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
We'll come to that.
My distance.
Absolutely. We'll come to that in a moment. But let's start off with the story, the headline in the Daily Telegraph. Many more families are going to lose loved ones. Now, this was the warning from Boris Johnson yesterday, a very stark and distressing warning for many people.
It was, and unsurprisingly, it's what has taken the headline space on just about every paper this morning, with the exception of The Sun, which has cough and you're off. Everybody else has run with this quote from the Prime Minister. It was a very sober press conference he gave yesterday, and really not a Boris Johnson that we are used to seeing at all. I think that he is having a good crisis so far, I think, partly because people are so surprised by the measured approach that he's been taking. Not everybody, of course, will agree with the nuanced approach that the Telegraph talks about, but I think that people are at least surprised by the Prime Minister's statesmanlike and sombre handling of the press conference yesterday.
Well, certainly, given that President Trump came under such criticism for how he handled his address to the nation, it is in stark contrast. However, the measures that have been introduced in other papers have really been criticised. Many commentators saying they do not go far enough. For example, here in The Guardian, there is criticism from other health experts saying actually England should follow the lead of other countries. In Scotland, different measures have been introduced, but they're saying, in fact, that the UK and this kind of go-it-alone approach is quite dangerous.
They are saying that. My own view is that the UK approach is the only one that seems to be more strategic. They seem to have a plan which is, as the Prime Minister put it, to flatten the sombrero. They don't want the peak of cases to come too quickly. They want it to come. They don't believe they can stop the disease spreading through the population. And therefore what they want to do is control the way that it spreads in order to be able to manage beds and hospital admissions accordingly. When people say, you know, we should have stopped this, we should have stopped that, we shouldn't let people fly in the way, say, that Donald Trump has done, what the British government is doing is looking at the scientific evidence, which apparently says this would just delay things by a day or two. Now, clearly, delaying things a day or two doesn't help anybody at all. So they're more focused on where the resource comes to deal with the problems which are now inevitable. The virus is in the population, it therefore will spread.
The problem is, though, many people watching this will be saying, look, I'm very worried about older relatives in my family, yet we're not being told to implement social distancing just yet. When you see what's happening in Italy, when the entire country on lockdown, that's very hard communication to make, isn't it?
It is. If you think about it, it's less than a month ago that there were 3 cases of coronavirus in Italy. There are now over 15,000. So, you know, the fact that the Italians have taken a different approach doesn't necessarily mean it's the right one. And you mentioned the contrast between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. Donald Trump's press conference yesterday, his announcement that he was going to ban travel from Europe to the United States, has had a calamitous effect on the stock markets, which will have a serious knock-on effect to people in their everyday lives in a way that actually the virus itself may not. The virus itself is going to be something that the vast majority of people who get it, 99%, will recover from. But the economic impact is going to have knock-on effects which have real-life consequences as well. So I think if you contrast the British Prime Minister with the American President, the way they're handling this, they are chalk and cheese. Particularly interesting given that these were two people who were often compared with each other, likened with each other. And I think that Boris Johnson's approach has been far the better.
You talk about the global stock markets. Headline, of course, in the Financial Times, a traumatic day. It describes yesterday, which has spurred central banks to step up action, although many people would also say, some market commentators saying, look, the European Central Bank, took action, launched this stimulus, but they really wanted to see a cut in the key rate of interest. People are saying, actually, perhaps not enough is being done. The Fed came up with some extra action, but certainly doesn't seem to have calmed markets.
No, it hasn't. And I think what we haven't seen is a coordinated approach. The British government published its budget on Wednesday. The Europeans have come out with something different. The Americans have come out with something different. So there isn't the same coordinated approach that we saw in the global financial crisis. And I think that is problematic. Also problematic is the fact that we don't have very much room. There isn't much that we can cut off interest rates. 0.5% in this country a couple of days ago, but we're now down at 0.25%. So there isn't very much wiggle room there, and the markets have been spooked accordingly. A number of stocks yesterday fell by more than a third.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the Japan Times, because it's reporting on how hospitals are low on the last resort remedy. Now, these are ECMO, resource intensive but cutting edge machine, which helps people to breathe, and there simply aren't enough to go round. A fraction in the UK, for example, compared to Japan.
Well, this comes back to the strategic point that we started with, which is that you need to make sure that this affects people at a time when they can get help. It's about the most vulnerable people being able to have medical attention when they need it. If everybody gets it at once, then clearly there are never going to be enough ECMO machines to support people. And this is a problem that's first arisen in Italy, where they are having to make decisions, to all reports, about who uses the machine and who doesn't. And they're making a straight choice on the basis of people's age. If somebody's younger, they're getting the support, and if they're older, they're not. So what we're trying to do here is to even that out so that the availability of the machines will cover more people as they get it, rather than everybody getting it at once and there still only being one set of machines that can be used. The Japanese, yes, they've had experience of using these machines before that hasn't been very good compared with some of the European impacts. The numbers are in the article here that there was a 90% survival rate when this machine was used in European countries like Finland and Sweden, but in Japan last time it was 30% because they weren't using the machines as effectively. So there is history on this, and they're trying to learn from it.
Let's move on now to this story about how apparently lots of people in Italy, of course, they're housebound, and pupils, instead of doing homework, are turning to online gaming. No surprise, really, with a Fortnite marathon and Call of Duty going on.
Yes, I mean, this is a slightly light-hearted story within a lot of very, very gloomy ones, which is that there's a problem with the amount of internet bandwidth as a result of the downloads of Fortnite and Call of Duty. And we were talking about earlier about which share prices can possibly go up in this kind of scenario with the markets in free fall. And of course, there are going to be some organisations that will benefit from new subscribers as a result of people coming in. Netflix is an obvious one.
Yeah, Microsoft,
you would expect them
Xbox
to see a spike, and Microsoft and
might need
these
multiple
gaming companies
Xboxes or PlayStations to stop fights in the house.
Quite possibly, whether you can go out and buy one or not remains to be seen.
Let's move on to this last story as well, about how to avoid shaking hands, because it seems that, this is a real issue because people are so used to, particularly here in the UK, of shaking hands when they meet somebody. It's a reflex. How do you stop that? How do you replace it?
Well, there was a lovely little film yesterday of Prince Charles going around and going as if to shake hands and then remembering that he shouldn't, and jumping up like this and greeting people like that. The one I like best is the woo handshake where you tap feet. But I think the one that is gaining the most traction is a touch of the elbows. I went to watch my daughter playing netball yesterday, and after the match, all the players congratulated each other by touching elbows as they went past.
Brilliant. Mark, thank you very much for all of that. So many other remedies as well. Thank you. Stay with us here on BBC News.